A few years ago, I rented a secluded cabin in the Smoky Mountains for a weekend getaway. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and I needed to get away from everything: my phone, the city, the constant reminders of what I had lost. The idea of being alone in nature, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life, seemed perfect. The cabin was deep in the woods, accessible only by a winding dirt road that barely fit my truck. It was the kind of place where cell service was non-existent, where the nearest town was over an hour away. At first, it was exactly what I needed. The air was crisp, the silence calming. I spent the first day hiking along a nearby stream, enjoying the peace that came with being so far removed from everything. I came across an old wooden bridge, covered in moss and sagging slightly in the middle, as if time had nearly swallowed it whole. A stream ran underneath, its water dark and still, reflecting the canopy of trees above. There were no signs of recent human activity, no footprints, no litter, just untouched wilderness. The first night, I sat on the deck with a beer, watching the sun dip behind the trees, the sky turning into a deep shade of purple. The stars were clearer than I had ever seen them, twinkling like scattered diamonds across the black sky. By the time darkness fell, the only sounds were the distant hoots of owls and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt safe, peaceful. That changed on the second night. I had just gone to bed, my body heavy with exhaustion, when I heard it. Footsteps on the deck. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. At first, I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a stray deer wandering too close. But then I listened closer. The footsteps weren't random. They were pacing. Someone, or something, was walking back and forth, just outside my bedroom window. I stayed perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. I had locked the cabin up before going to bed. I knew for a fact that the deck only wrapped around one side of the house. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. Summoning my courage, I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand and crept toward the window. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain and shined the light outside. Nothing. The deck was empty. The woods beyond were still. No movement, no sign of anything. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe I was just on edge, letting my imagination get the best of me. I turned off the flashlight and crawled back into bed, forcing myself to relax. I was almost asleep when the noise came again. This time it was louder. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom window. I shot up, my skin crawling. The sound wasn't just footsteps now, it was breathing. Long, deep inhales, ragged, slow exhales. Someone was standing there, just beyond the glass, just out of view. My hands trembled as I grabbed my flashlight again and flicked it on. I yanked back the curtain. Nothing. The deck was empty, but the breathing hadn't stopped. It was still there, still deep and deliberate, as if whatever it was knew I couldn't see it. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The air went completely silent again. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my flashlight in my hand, listening for any sound, any movement, but nothing else happened. When the sun finally rose, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the wind had played tricks on me. I was ready to put it behind me, chalk it up to my overactive mind, until I checked the deck. There were footprints, not boot prints, not sneakers, bare feet. The prints were large, human, leading from the edge of the woods to my bedroom window. But the strangest thing? There were no prints leading away. I packed my things immediately. I didn't care that I had paid for another night. I threw my bag in the truck and peeled out of there as fast as I could. Halfway down the dirt road, I realized I had left my phone charger inside. For a brief second, I considered turning back, but a sudden feeling of wrongness filled my gut, like I was being watched, like someone, was standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond my sight. I didn't stop driving. When I returned the keys to the rental company, I mentioned what had happened, half expecting them to laugh it off. Instead, the woman at the desk gave me a strange look. "You heard the footsteps?" she asked. I hesitated. "Yeah, and the breathing." She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "You're not the first. Other guests have said the same thing. Some have even seen something, a shadow in the woods, a figure standing on the deck. But when they check, there's never anything there." I felt sick. "So what is it?" She just shrugged. "We don't know. No one ever stays long enough to find out." I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind howls through the trees outside my window, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, deliberate breathing, waiting, watching, just outside the glass. My family owns a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. It's been in our family for generations, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and eventually, it'll be mine. Growing up, I spent a lot of time there, fishing in the nearby creek, hiking the trails that wound through the endless trees, and sitting by the fire at night, listening to my dad tell stories about the land. It was always a place of peace for me, until one winter. It was late December, just after Christmas. My cousin Jeremy and I decided to take a trip to the cabin for a few days of hunting and getting away from the chaos of holiday gatherings. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest town, completely off-grid, with no electricity and no cell service. It was just us, a wood stove, a couple of rifles, and the quiet expanse of the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We spent the day setting up, chopping firewood, and scouting the area for deer tracks. By nightfall, we were exhausted. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the temperature had dropped to nearly zero, and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. At around midnight, just as we were drifting off to sleep, we heard it. 3 knocks, loud, deliberate, coming from the back door. Jeremy and I sat up instantly, our eyes locking in the dim light. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. No one was supposed to be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and we hadn't seen a single soul since arriving. "Did you hear that?" Jeremy whispered. I nodded, barely breathing. We sat in silence, waiting for it to happen again. 3 more knocks. I reached for the rifle leaning against the wall beside my cot, my fingers tightening around the stock. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the door. Jeremy followed, his own rifle in hand. The only sound was the wind outside, whistling through the trees. I took a deep breath, gripped the doorknob, and yanked it open. Nothing. The snow outside was untouched. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The trees stood still under the weight of the heavy snowfall, their branches drooping in the icy air. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. There was no one there. Jeremy exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe it was an animal?" I shook my head. What animal knocks? We checked the entire perimeter of the cabin, but the snow was undisturbed. No tracks, no sign of life. The knocks had come from something, but whatever it was had left no trace. Uneasy, we locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Neither of us slept well that night. The next day, we tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been ice cracking somewhere, or a branch snapping in the wind. We spent the day hiking, setting up a hunting blind, and making sure we had enough firewood. But as the sun set, the sense of unease returned. And then, at midnight, 3 knocks. This time, they came from the front door. Jeremy and I jumped out of our cots, grabbing our rifles again. My pulse pounded in my ears as I motioned for him to take one side of the door while I took the other. 3 more knocks. It was steady, purposeful, almost taunting. I clenched my jaw and yanked the door open. Nothing. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no movement, no sound beyond the howling void of the forest. I shined my flashlight across the snow. No tracks. The porch was completely undisturbed. Jeremy's face was pale. "Dude, I don't like this." "Me neither." We slammed the door shut and locked it. I moved the chair back under the handle. This time, we didn't try to sleep. We sat by the fire, our rifles close, waiting. At around 3 a.m., just when we thought it was over, 3 knocks, but this time they came from the window. I don't remember moving, don't remember thinking. I just lifted my rifle and aimed at the window. The firelight cast a faint reflection against the glass, and for a split second, I saw something standing just beyond the porch. A tall figure, too thin, too still, and then it was gone. I ran to the door and threw it open, stepping onto the porch, my breath visible in the freezing air. The trees stretched out into the blackness, silent and endless. The figure was nowhere to be seen. The snow was still undisturbed. Something had been standing right there, right outside our window, and yet there were no footprints. We didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, we packed up our things and got the hell out of there. We told my dad and uncle about it when we got back, expecting them to laugh it off, but they didn't. Instead, my uncle leaned forward, his expression dark. "That's not the first time someone's heard knocking out there," he said quietly. "Your granddad used to talk about it. Said he'd hear knocking late at night, always in threes, always at the window." I swallowed hard. What did he think it was? My uncle hesitated before answering. "Something that doesn't leave tracks." Jeremy and I never went back to the cabin after that. My dad still goes sometimes, but never alone, and never during the winter. He won't say why, but I think I already know. Because sometimes, when the wind is just right and the snow is falling thick, something out there comes knocking. And it's not looking for shelter. Blackwood Cabin had always been in my family. It was deep in the Pacific Northwest, nestled in a thick forest of towering pines and ancient oaks. My grandfather built it by hand in the 1950s, and since then, it had been a place of refuge, a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. As a child, I spent entire summers there, hiking through the woods, swimming in the nearby lake, and listening to my grandfather's stories about the land. But as I grew older, life pulled me away. College, work, relationships. Years passed, and the cabin became a distant memory, a relic of my childhood that I always meant to return to, but never did. Until last October. After a particularly difficult year, stress at work, a painful breakup, I needed a place to clear my head. Somewhere quiet, somewhere familiar. The cabin seemed like the perfect escape. I packed a week's worth of supplies, loaded my car, and made the long drive up the winding mountain roads. The air was crisp when I arrived, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The cabin stood just as I remembered it, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy, the stone chimney rising high above the roof, and the wraparound porch offering a breathtaking view of the dense forest beyond. It was late afternoon, and the golden light filtering through the trees cast long shadows across the clearing. Unlocking the door, I was greeted by the familiar scent of aged wood and the faint musk of time. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through the windows. Everything was just as we had left it. Old furniture, my grandfather's hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, and the worn bookshelves lined with novels whose pages had yellowed with age. I spent the first evening settling in, sweeping away dust, airing out the rooms, and stacking logs in the fireplace. As dusk fell, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, watching the last light of day fade behind the treetops. The stillness was profound, almost too quiet. There was no hum of traffic, no distant chatter of neighbors, only the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. That first night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're far from the noise of civilization. But on the second night, something changed. I was sitting by the fireplace, reading one of the old books from the shelf, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. Not at the door, at the window. I froze. The sound had come from the large living room window behind me. My breath hitched as I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the glass. The darkness outside pressed against it like a living thing, the reflection of the firelight flickering in the glass. But beyond that, nothing. I told myself it was a tree branch knocking against the cabin in the wind, but there was no wind. The night was utterly still. A second knock came, softer this time. I set my book down carefully and stood. My heart pounded as I stepped toward the window. I hesitated before pulling the curtain aside. The porch was empty. The clearing beyond was untouched, the trees standing tall and silent under the full moon's glow. I exhaled, shaking my head. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself. But just as I turned away, a shadow moved at the tree line. It was subtle, barely more than a flicker, but I saw it. A figure, tall and motionless, standing between the trees. My stomach twisted into knots. I stood there, staring, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. For what felt like an eternity, it remained frozen, its form blending with the darkness of the forest. Then, just as I was about to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, it shifted, not like a person, not like an animal. It melted backward, retreating into the trees in a way that sent ice down my spine. I shut the curtain and locked the door. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. I kept telling myself it was nothing, an overactive imagination, exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I spent the day hiking to clear my mind, but the feeling of being watched never left. It clung to me like a shadow, growing heavier as the sun sank lower. And then, at midnight, I woke to the sound of knocking. 3 knocks, slow, measured. This time, they came from the back door. I sat up in bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the dim light from the dying fire. The knocking came again. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed and clicked it on. My hands were shaking as I stood and crept toward the back of the cabin. The door was locked. I hesitated, then pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. I exhaled. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe Dash. Bang! The door rattled violently against its frame, the sound reverberating through the cabin. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My skin crawled. Something was outside. I backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on the door. My mind raced through the possibilities. A bear, a trespasser. But no animal would knock. No person would stand outside in the freezing cold at this hour. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting, and then faintly, so faint I almost didn't hear it. A whisper, right against the door. "Emily." I ran. I grabbed my car keys, threw on my boots, and bolted for the front door. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't care that I had nowhere else to go. I needed to leave. I flung the door open, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and stopped dead. The clearing was filled with footprints, not just one set, dozens. They crisscrossed in the snow, weaving between the trees, circling the cabin. Some led up to the windows, others stopped directly in front of the door. I felt sick. I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I never told my family what happened. I never went back to the cabin. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I wake up to the sound of knocking. Always 3 knocks, always at my window, and when I check, there's never anyone there, but the footprints are.